If you're a writer or you're looking to work on your first novel, then you come to the right channel. My name's Stephen and I'm a traditionally published fantasy author. Today I'm doing 5 tips for writing a fantasy novel. To date I've got 8 fantasy novels published and they're all traditionally published, but this also applies to if you're going to be self-publishing a novel. Tip number 1, read within the genre, especially within fantasy genre, because it's quite broad. You need to know what's going on, you need to know about past trends, you need to know what's going on in the market in the present. You need to be aware that if you're going to write something, you're not chasing a trend, because if it's gone and past, there's no point trying to write something now as a Me Too book. You need to know who the authors are, you need to know who the editors are and the publishers. You need to have a bit of a business awareness really. So you've got the creative side with writing the book, but also the business awareness wouldn't hurt you to know what's going on in the market at the present and how it kind of works. A little bit of awareness of where your book would sit in terms of the genre can be useful, but don't worry too much about it. That will come in time, and also you probably have a bit of an idea of what you're doing in terms of genre or subgenre, because if you're writing fantasy and you read it, then you'll be able to say, well, my book's a bit like this guy and that girl, and that's where it sits, somewhere between those two, and based upon that you can say, you know, my book is grimdark but also it has a bit of this, or maybe it's low magic and it has crime elements but it falls still within the fantasy genre. So knowing a little bit of awareness of that is fine, but the publisher would probably tweak it later on and tell you where it would sit on the shelf. The other thing to be aware of is tropes within the genre. Fantasy readers are quite smart. If you're going to use a trope, then you need to be aware of them, and if you're going to do something different, if you're doing the same thing over and over again that you've seen 100 times, if this wasn't your book and you were just picking it up and reading it for the first time, how interested would you be with it? Be honest. So if you're using a trope, be aware of it. If you're going to subvert it and do something new with it, that's great. If you can subvert expectations and put a new fresh twist on it, that's great. But if all you're doing is exactly the same kind of story that you've read 100 times and you've seen 100 times, the likelihood of it being picked up is quite low unless you do something different. Tip number 2. World building. You need to think about this ahead of time and really focus on it. Spend some time building your world, not years. Don't spend years doing it. I'd say maximum 12 months, but even then, that's too much. Because if all you're doing is spending years world building the book, that isn't writing the book. You might say, oh, well, it's important so that the things work in a consistent fashion and so on. Absolutely, that is important. Like, it feels real. But if you spend longer than a year world building a book, that's too long, because most of what you've put in that plan will not end up on the page. Most of it isn't shown to the reader. They just don't care about it. As long as it hangs together and there's consistency behind it and they get the impression that there's depth to the world, that's what they want. They want to be submerged in a world that feels real to the characters. They can move left or right and they know that there's not just going to be a blank page. That's what is important. But spending months and months and years, that's not writing. That's not helpful. That's not useful. I really don't think it's going to serve you at all. The market is very crowded today, so you need to write about what you're passionate about. Don't try and follow a trend. Don't try and copy someone else. What publishers and agents want is something unique, something interesting, and they want fresh voices. They want diverse characters. They want diverse authors more than ever, because if you have 100 books, say it's a farm boy going on a quest, it's a trope we've seen 100 times, 1,000 times. If you can do something new and different and clever and interesting with it, great. But if it's the same old, then it's just not going to be very popular. So write about something that you're passionate about. Think about all of your hobbies, think about all of your interests, think about everything that makes you uniquely you that no one else has. I'll give you some examples to kind of illustrate this. Adrian Tchaikovsky is a very popular science fiction and fantasy author. His first 10-book series is Shadows of the Apt, and he has characters in there that are called the Kindin, and they all have different aspects of insects. He's very much into insects and beetles and all that kind of stuff. He then wrote another book, Children of Time, which went on to win the Arthur C. Clarke Award, and in that he has spiders in space colonizing a planet. So that's a massive interest of his, and he has a lot of knowledge and a lot of information that you can impart to the reader, but in an interesting way. It's not just a data dump. That's something that's unique to him and that's passionate about, and it comes through on the page. So think about all of your things. Think about what you're interested in. I'm interested in archery because I did it in the past, so I can put realistic archery stuff in my books. I'm very interested in blacksmithing. I once went and made a sword for a day, learned a lot more from doing that as much as I had from reading it. So in the future, when I put things about making swords in my books and stuff, it's a little bit more accurate, it feels a bit more real because it's something that I like. Another example is R.J. Barker. He reads a lot of kind of nautical fiction and films. He likes all that kind of stuff with people on sailing ships and that sort of stuff. His new series, The Bone Ships, features ships that are made out of the bones of dragons, as you might expect from the title, but that's something he's really interested in, all the nautical stuff, and he adds stuff and creates stuff on top of the basis of what he's read and made something completely fresh and different within a fantasy setting. But that's just one of his passions, something he wanted to write about. So do something different, do something that's unique to you, think about what it might be, and try and fold that into the book and into the world building. Tip number 3, there's the story and there's what the book is about. You should know the story ahead of time. If you can know what the book is about, that's fine, but you don't need to. So the difference is obviously the story is what happens. What it's about is the theme. If you think about, you know, any big book, a fantasy book, Lord of the Rings or whatever it might be, Lord of the Rings is all about even the smallest person can make a difference in the world. I haven't mentioned hobbits, rings, wars, elves, anywhere in that. But if you don't know what the themes are of the book ahead of time, that's fine. But you will find that out as you go from writing a story and when you get to the end of the book. If you do know the themes ahead of time, then that can be useful because you can kind of course correct yourself, but don't worry about it too much because it'll come out in the edits and in the drafts, and when other people read it they might say, oh, this bit just veers off suddenly, and you're thinking, oh yeah, I'm not really sure why I did that. But in the moment when you're writing it, you won't really know. So you definitely need to know the story ahead of time. Even if you're someone who makes it up as you go along, some kind of very basic plan, even if it's in the back of your mind, needs to be there so that you know what you're going to do, where it's going, and how it's going to evolve. Tip number 4 is who, or the characters. You absolutely have to know who the characters are. Just as I said with the world building, spend some time working on the characters to make them feel realistic. You could imagine that they're an actor on a TV show and you write a basic biography of them, you know, a couple of paragraphs, who they are. That's not everything from when they were born to where they are in the present, but all of the basic things. Look at some of your favourite actors on IMDb or whatever it might be and pick out a few things and say, okay, if I was going to write a biography about this person in a very short fashion, what would I say? Like, I know, Hugh Jackman, you could say the biggest hits of his life were he went on to do Wolverine, that he acted in those roles for 20 years, and before that he's a big song and dance man, he broke out into music. And so, you know, you pick out bits and pieces. So craft the characters, make them feel real, spend time with them, but don't spend years and years and years on them because that isn't useful. Just, it isn't. There again, it's world building, it's not writing the book. So think about the characters, think about who they are. There's lots of exercises you can do. Put 2 of your characters in a room and just start writing conversation. It doesn't have to be in the book, but find their voice that way. You could just do an exercise with, you know, they're arguing about something. How would one person talk? How would the other person react? Does one always get angry? Is one always calm? Is one very deeply religious? Is one, you know, just work your way through the characters. Spend some time with them in your head and on the page if you want. Do some exercises, practice, but know your characters inside and out so that when you get to a situation in the book, you know how they're going to react. The other thing, of course, is that characters absolutely make or break a book. If a story is brilliant and their characters are flat and they just don't sound like real people, that can completely derail a book. So it's very important that you spend time with them and learn who they are before you write the book. Tip number 5 is magic. You don't have to have magic in a fantasy book, however many of them do. To what degree, that is completely up to you. Some people have very complicated, detailed, hard magic systems, as they're called. This is where they've described everything in detail. They know that A leads to B leads to C, produces this outcome. Then there's soft magic. This is something where it's a bit more vague, a bit more mysterious, and a bit more complicated. It could be behind the scenes, but you never find that out. But whatever system you're using, there has to be some kind of rules, there has to be some kind of cost for the magic. It can't be just a MacGuffin. People who don't read fantasy think that fantasy books are easy to write, because if you have a problem and it's got magic, a wizard can just wave their hand and it solves the problem, solves the plot and the story, and then you move forward. If magic is just being used as a MacGuffin, then it needs to change. It should never be that. It should be something that you've thought about, even if it's a case of, well, I don't want to show people a bit, I want it to be weird and cool and interesting, but the reader never finds out completely how it works. That's fine. You don't have to stick with what other people have said you must do. If some people say that the most popular authors have hard magic systems, then that's what you should be writing. That's just not true, because not all readers like the hard magic systems. So you need to write what you're interested in. Whichever way you go, decide ahead of time, plan that, spend some time building the system behind the scenes, decide how much you're going to show to the reader, and then move forward, because you have to be passionate about the magic system too, because people will ask questions, and it's then up to you to decide how much you reveal even later on after the book has come out. So those are 5 tips for writing a fantasy novel. I'll do some more in the future if you're interested. Any other topics you want me to talk about, let me know. There are other links to other videos about getting a publisher, getting an agent, editing your book and that sort of stuff. But I'll be back very soon with another video. If you'd like and subscribe, I really appreciate it.